September 4th, 476 AD, the Roman Empire is gone, and almost nobody noticed. That is not a dramatic exaggeration for effect. That is genuinely, historically, what happened. The most powerful civilization the Western world had ever produced. The empire that built roads stretching from Scotland to Syria, that gave the world concrete and sewage systems and the calendar you still use today, ended. And the people living inside it largely went about their Tuesday. No explosion, no final battle, no dramatic last stand on the walls of Rome with torches burning and legions dying. The Western Roman Empire ended the way a business closes when it runs out of money, quietly, with paperwork, and a teenage boy handing over a crown he never should have had in the first place. This is the real story of the day Rome fell, and it is nothing like what you were told. Let's go back further first, because to understand what happened on September 4th, 476, you need to understand what Rome actually was by that point, and what it was already a ghost. At its peak, roughly the 1st and 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire controlled territory stretching across 3 continents. 60 million people lived inside its borders. It had professional standing armies, a legal system, a postal service, standardized currency, indoor plumbing in its major cities, and a road network so well built that large sections of it still exist today. It was the closest thing the ancient world ever produced to a functioning superstate. By 476, that Rome was long dead. What remained in the West was something that wore Rome's name the way an old man wears a coat that once fit him perfectly. The population of the city of Rome itself had dropped from over 1 million at its peak to somewhere around 80,000. The legions that had once held the entire known world in check were now largely composed of Germanic soldiers fighting under Germanic commanders for emperors who changed so fast nobody could keep track of them. In the 50 years before 476, the Western Roman Empire had 27 different emperors. 27 in 50 years. Most of them were appointed by powerful military commanders, reigned for months, and were then killed by the next powerful military commander who wanted the job. The throne of the Western Roman Empire had become the most dangerous seat in the world. Which brings us to the boy. His name was Romulus Augustulus. He was somewhere between 14 and 16 years old when he became emperor. His father, a Roman general named Orestes, had seized power and placed his teenage son on the throne in 475. Not because the boy had any particular claim to it, any political support, or any genuine power, but because having a puppet emperor gave Orestes control of the title without the personal risk of wearing it. Romulus Augustulus was emperor in name only. He had no army. He had no treasury worth speaking of. He had no political allies. He was a teenager sitting on a collapsing throne in a crumbling empire, while his father made all the actual decisions and the real power in Italy, a Germanic military leader named Odoacer, prepared to end the whole arrangement permanently. Here is what the day Rome fell actually looked like. Odoacer and his Germanic soldiers had been demanding land grants inside Italy for years. The Roman military had a long tradition of rewarding soldiers with land. It was part of how you kept an army loyal. Orestes refused. So Odoacer did what powerful men with armies did in the 5th century. He marched. He defeated and killed Orestes in late August of 476. And then he turned his attention to the teenage emperor sitting alone in Ravenna. Because by this point, the actual capital of the Western Empire had moved to Ravenna, not Rome, for defensive reasons, and simply took the crown. What happened next is the part nobody tells you. Odoacer did not execute Romulus Augustulus. He looked at this frightened teenage boy, this figurehead emperor who had never held any real power and posed no genuine threat to anyone, and he pensioned him off. He gave Romulus a comfortable villa in Campania, near the modern city of Naples, and a generous annual income, and told him to go live quietly and never involve himself in politics again. And then Odoacer did something that, in retrospect, is the most historically significant part of this entire story. He gathered the imperial regalia, the crown, the robes, the symbols of Western Roman imperial power, and he sent them east, to Constantinople, to the court of the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno, along with a letter explaining that the West no longer needed a separate emperor. That one emperor ruling from Constantinople was enough. That letter and that box of imperial symbols traveling east is what historians mark as the end of the Western Roman Empire. Not a battle, not a massacre, a diplomatic package. Now stop and let that settle for a moment. The empire that had defined Western civilization for 5 centuries ended with a package delivery and a teenager being told to go enjoy his pension. But here is what makes this genuinely complicated. Here is where the story becomes something other than a simple collapse narrative. Most of the people living in what had been the Western Roman Empire in 476 did not experience anything different on September 5th than they had on September 3rd. The farmers in Gaul were still farming. The merchants in North Africa were still trading. The bishops in Rome were still running the church. The roads were still there. The aqueducts were still flowing in many places. Latin was still the language of administration and religion and educated life throughout the West. What changed was who sat at the top of the political structure. And for most ordinary Romans, the vast majority of the 60 million people who had lived inside the empire's borders, the man at the top of the political structure had been largely irrelevant to their daily lives for decades. The emperor changed so often, controlled so little real territory, and commanded such diminished actual authority that his existence or non-existence barely registered in the lived experience of ordinary people. The Roman Empire did not fall like a building collapses. It dissolved, slowly, over generations, like salt in water. The process historians call the fall of Rome actually took roughly 300 years, depending on where you start counting. You could start with the crisis of the 3rd century, when Rome nearly tore itself apart through civil war in the 200s. You could start with the formal division of the empire into western and eastern halves in 285. You could start with the Visigoth sack of Rome in 410, which was the moment that genuinely shocked the ancient world. The moment that made people realize something fundamental had broken. That 410 sack is worth pausing on, because that was the moment that felt like the end to the people who lived through it. When the Visigoths entered Rome in August of 410, the first time a foreign force had entered and plundered the city in 800 years, the psychological impact across the Roman world was catastrophic. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem when he heard the news, wrote that his voice failed him and his words were choked with sobs. The city that had ruled the world had been violated. People who had built their entire sense of cosmic order around Rome's permanence, around the idea that Rome was simply what civilization was, did not know how to process it. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most important thinkers in early Christian history, wrote his most famous work, The City of God, partly as a response to this moment, trying to explain to devastated Romans that their faith should not rest in earthly cities, however magnificent, because earthly cities fall. He was right. They do. But here is the detail about 410 that complicates the clean narrative. The Visigoths left after 3 days. They sacked the city and moved on. Rome was damaged, traumatized, partially emptied, but it still stood. The institutions kept functioning. The Western Empire kept lurching forward for another 66 years, and then 476 arrived. The actual, official, documented end. The moment historians agree on. And it came and went so quietly that many educated Romans living through it may not have even registered it as the end of anything. The Eastern Roman Empire, meanwhile, kept going. This is the part that permanently breaks the simple fall narrative. When people say Rome fell in 476, they are talking specifically about the western half. The Eastern Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople, did not fall in 476. It did not fall for another 1,000 years. It kept the Roman name, kept Roman law, kept calling its citizens Romans, kept expanding and contracting and fighting and surviving until 1453, when Ottoman forces under Mehmed II finally took Constantinople, 1453. That is when the last direct institutional continuation of the Roman Empire ended, not 476. The East survived the fall of the West by nearly a millennium. The people living in Constantinople in 900 AD would have told you and genuinely believed that they were Romans, citizens of Rome, not former Romans, not inheritors of Rome, Romans. So what did fall in 476? What fell was the idea, the political fiction that a single Roman authority governed the Western Mediterranean, the administrative structure that connected the laws and taxes and roads and legions of the West under one imperial roof. That fell. And it had been falling for so long, so gradually, so visibly to everyone paying attention, that the final formal moment of its ending was almost anticlimactic. What replaced it was not chaos. What replaced it was something new that did not yet have a name. The Germanic kingdoms that carved up the territory of the former Western Empire, the Visigoths in Iberia, the Franks in Gaul, the Ostrogoths in Italy, did not destroy Roman culture. They absorbed it. They used Roman administrative systems. They employed Roman bureaucrats. They converted to Christianity, the Roman Empire's official religion. They modeled their courts on Roman traditions. The Roman world did not vanish in 476. It transformed, slowly, into something that would eventually become medieval Europe, into the kingdoms and languages and legal traditions and religious structures that would define the next 1,000 years of Western history. And at the center of all of it, still standing, still functioning, its population reduced, but its symbolic power unchanged, was the city of Rome, ruled by popes now instead of emperors, but still Rome. So here is the honest answer to what happened the day Rome fell. A frightened teenager handed a crown to a man who didn't want the title. That man mailed the symbols of empire to the east. Most people went about their lives. The roads kept being used. The laws kept being applied. The churches kept filling on Sundays. And the thing that had been the mightiest empire in Western history quietly finished its long, slow process of becoming something else. There was no last stand. There was no dramatic final hour. There was no moment when someone looked up at burning walls and knew that an era had ended. History rarely ends the way stories do. The greatest empire in Western history did not go out like a fire. It went out like a light left on in an empty room, dimming gradually, for so long that by the time it finally went dark, most people had already left.